The sky should have been empty, but on that morning, it wasn't. Instead, it was filled with them hundreds of American B-17 flying fortresses, their engines forming a rolling curtain of sound as sunlight flashed across their wings. The formation stretched from horizon to horizon, a moving landscape of metal and precision. To the Luftwaffe pilots preparing below, it didn't look like a routine mission. It looked like an entire front arriving at once. They climbed to meet the incoming formation, unaware of what waited for them above the clouds. Because hidden within that massive group of aircraft was something unexpected, a level of coordination and defensive discipline that transformed the formation into a barrier difficult to penetrate. Aircraft that approached expecting openings instead encountered layers of organized defensive fire, each bomber protecting the others with practiced precision. For many intercepting pilots, some sent brief radio messages back to base, noting only 2 words, "Dead, it's overwhelming." This was the moment when the B-17 Flying Fortress didn't simply complete its mission, it demonstrated a level of teamwork and resilience that reshaped the day's outcome. The rising wall of steel. The Germans had grown accustomed to American bombing raids, but what lifted off on this day was unlike anything they had faced before. Wave after wave of B-17s, engines roaring, propellers flashing, climbed toward formation altitude. Each plane bristled with 50 caliber guns, each one crewed by young men who had seen too many of their friends vanish into smoke and flame. For the gunners, the B-17 was more than a bomber. It was a fortress they lived inside, and sometimes died inside. Inside that aluminum skin were men like the tail gunner, squeezed into a metal tube with nothing but plexiglass behind him and death on his heels. The ball turret gunner, curled inside a rotating metal sphere, praying he wouldn't get stuck during landing. The bombardier, whose Norden bombsight made him both the most valuable and the most vulnerable man on the plane. Each B-17 carried 6,000 pounds of bombs, but today those bombs were secondary. The real firepower was the trap the Allies had set in motion, the Allied plan, Operation Argument. By early 1944, the Germans still had a dangerous advantage, their fighter force. The Jagdwaffe could mass quickly and tear apart unescorted bombers. The Allies needed to break the Luftwaffe's back before the stayed D-Day landings. That meant luring the German fighters into battle and destroying them in the air, along with their irreplaceable pilots. So the Americans devised a brutal strategy of send so many bombers at once that the Germans would have no choice but to attack. To meet them would be death. To ignore them would be disaster. It was a no-win situation, and the Germans walked straight into it. German radars light up. In bunkers across northern Germany, radar operators suddenly saw the impossible. A formation so large it looked like a thunderstorm made of steel. Operators shouted warnings. Phones rang in the fighter command posts. And within minutes, the order was given: Fokke scramble all Gripen, intercept immediately. Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Fokke Wolf FW-190s roared down their runways, climbing as fast as they could. Veteran German pilots, many with dozens of kills, looked at the radar reports and felt something they rarely felt: uncertainty. 800 bombers, that many. This was not a raid, this was a declaration. The ambush begins. The first German fighters reached the formation just as the sun broke through the clouds, illuminating the B-17 Armada like a massive silver wall stretching miles across the sky. The Germans had seen large formations before, but not one this deep, this tight, this overwhelming. And then they saw the escorts. At first a few silhouettes, then dozens, then hundreds. P-51 Mustangs, P-47 Thunderbolts, P-38 Lightnings. The American fighters were everywhere, above, below, behind, and inside the bomber stream. The Luftwaffe had walked into a kill zone. The first attack. A group of FW-190s peeled off from altitude, diving toward the leading box of B-17s. The bomber gunners tightened their grips. Fighters, 11 o'clock high. Tracer fire lit the sky like glowing ropes. The Germans dove straight through it, wings shaking, cannons firing, engines screaming. The first B-17 took a burst to the cockpit and vanished in a sphere of orange fire. But the formation held. The wall didn't break, and then the trap snapped shut. The Mustangs strike back. From the sun came the Mustangs, diving like hawks. Their Packard-built Merlin engines howled as they slammed into the German fighters. In seconds, the sky became a swirling tornado of twisting fighters and Mustangs chasing FW-190s. Thunderbolts diving after 109's P-38 slicing sideways through the formation. American pilots had the advantage: altitude, numbers, and fuel. German pilots had none of those things. Every minute they fought, Germany bled, and the Allies grew stronger. The bombers keep moving. Through all of this chaos, the B-17s continued their slow, brutal march toward the target, even as fighters battled around them. Even as explosions rocked their wings, they pressed forward, steady, committed, unstoppable. One fortress lost 2 engines, but stayed in formation. Another had half its tail shot away, yet the gunner kept firing. A bombardier, wounded and bleeding, refused evacuation so he could complete the run. Each bomber was a moving demolition charge, and each crew was willing to die to keep that wall moving. The Luftwaffe begins to break. German commanders realized they were losing too many planes, too many pilots, too quickly. The escorts were everywhere. The bombers were still coming. The German fighter force was being carved apart in mid-air. Veterans who had survived years of brutal combat saw something they'd never seen before: Allied air supremacy, not by accident, not by timing, but by design. The B-17s had forced the Luftwaffe into a corner, and the American fighters were finishing the job. The final attack. Desperate, the Germans launched one last coordinated strike against the tail end of the bomber stream. Dozens of 109s and 190s lined up for a head-on attack, the most dangerous maneuver possible. B-17 gunners opened up with everything they had. The front of the formation became a wall of lead. A German ace named Willy Nedemann rolled his 190 into the attack and flew straight into the storm. A burst from a B-17's chin turret punched through his engine block, and his fighter erupted into fragments. Another group tried to dive in from below, but the ball turret gunners shredded the attack before they could reach firing range. The B-17s were bleeding, but so was the Luftwaffe, and Germany was running out of blood. The bombs fall. When the bombers finally reach their target, after hours of tension, freezing winds, and relentless enemy fire, the moment of release felt almost unreal. Bomb bays opened like steel jaws, and thousands of pounds of explosives dropped in long, glittering lines toward the industrial heart of Germany. Factories, assembly halls, rail yards, and fuel depots disappeared beneath rolling waves of fire and concussion. Columns of black smoke twisted upward as firestorms ignited, turning daylight into a dim, flickering haze. Every explosion wasn't just destruction, it was a calculated strike meant to break the German war machine piece by piece. Assembly lines halted, transport routes choked, and production staggered under the weight of each raid. The Luftwaffe, already exhausted and bleeding from the brutal air battles in the clouds above, had nothing left to throw at them. The mission was complete, but the real victory had already been won in the sky. The long road home. Returning home was never the easy part of a mission. In many ways, it was the most painful. After the bombs were released and the formation turned back toward England, the real battle began. Bombers that had gone in proud and strong came back torn open, engines coughing black smoke, control surfaces barely hanging on. The cold wind rushed through holes ripped by flak, biting into wounded men who had no strength left to scream. Sometimes entire crews worked together just to keep their aircraft alive. A B-17, running on a single engine, its other 3 silent and smoking, somehow managed to claw its way across the North Sea, losing altitude mile by mile until the English coastline finally emerged through the clouds. Another fortress, its hydraulic system completely destroyed, was forced to belly land with sparks flying beneath it. Yet miraculously, all 9 men aboard survived. Inside these battered flying fortresses, the mood was different on the way home. The adrenaline was gone. The shock was setting in. The waist gunners, once fierce and alert, now stared through shattered windows at the formation, counting, always counting. Because every open space in the sky, every bomber that failed to rejoin the group, meant 10 empty bunks waiting back at base, 10 uniforms that wouldn't be worn again, 10 meals that would never be eaten. The silence on those return flights was heavy. Filled with grief, no one dared speak. Some men cried quietly beneath oxygen masks. Others clenched their fists, praying the plane would hold together for just a few more minutes. The long road home wasn't just a flight, it was a test of will, faith, and endurance. A reminder that survival was never guaranteed, not even after the battle was over. The final tally: the Luftwaffe lost so many fighters and experienced pilots that it never fully recovered. In a single day, Germany's last hope for air superiority was shattered. It wasn't luck, it wasn't chance, it was strategy. Using the B-17 Flying Fortress not just as a bomber, but as a weapon to flush the enemy into the open. 800 flying fortresses had done something no one expected. They forced the Luftwaffe to fight on America's terms and lose, the legacy of the day the sky turned metal. When the survivors landed back in England, they didn't think of themselves as heroes. They were exhausted, grieving, sometimes broken. But history would remember what they did. The mission became one of the turning points of the air war, a day when American industrial power, tactical brilliance, and raw courage collided in the sky over Europe. The Luftwaffe could never again challenge the Allied air armada. From that day forward, the bomber streams grew larger, the fighter escorts more aggressive, and the skies over Germany turned from gray to Allied blue. And it all began with a trap and 800 flying demolition charges leading the way.